Welcome to Talking with Tatchell. The government is boasting that it has cut asylum applications and increased the deportation of would-be refugees. But those of us who work inside the asylum system, helping those who are seeking refuge, know that this is not something the government should boast about with pride. Indeed, the whole system is riddled with unfairness and injustice. Many genuine refugees are being described as failed asylum seekers and sent back to their home countries, often putting themselves at great risk. With me to discuss the injustices of the asylum system, its many failings, are Dr Raadt, who is an asylum worker with the Church's Commission for Racial Justice, Maria, a former asylum detainee from an ex-Soviet bloc country. We can't reveal her full details in order to protect her family in her home country, and Dr Frank Arnold, who is the clinical advisor to the Medical Justice Network. Thank you all for joining us. I'd like to start with you, Pak. The government has a policy, an official policy, but the reality is very different. Do you want to give me some examples?
Let me say first of all that in principle Britain has an extremely good, detailed and humane asylum policy. The problem is that what is presented to the public and to Parliament as fair policy is contradicted by what I would call operational obstructions. In each area of asylum, whether it is legal representation or detention or medical care or evidence, or there are measures put in place which are virtually unaccountable, and the result of which is that people do not have the fair access to fair legal procedure that they should have under the International Human Rights Conventions and the Refugee Convention. Let me give you some examples. We have in 2004 seen a massive reduction in legal aid, with a massive 2/3 reduction in the time lawyers can spend on preparing asylum cases. We have now, with the new Legal Services Bill and the Carter Report, seen the financial rewards that makes a solicitor's firm viable cut to the bone, and we are once again losing asylum lawyers, which is a highly specialized group, at an enormous rate.
So in other words,
we had 600 in 2004. We now have less than 400, and at the moment there's a brain drain going on.
So in other words, you know, people seeking asylum do not actually get access to the legal aid support they need
because
to present their case.
They're writing the good asylum lawyers out of the system. And the second point of this, they have speeded up for the sake of efficiency, because the Home Office is so often accused of being inefficient. They have accelerated procedure and increased end-to-end detention to such an extent that it's virtually impossible for an asylum seeker to orient themselves, inform themselves, and look for a good lawyer. They apply a merits test for having representation at appeals, the standards of which are set impossibly high and are very unreasonable. So those are major problems. There are many others, but those are two examples.
Well, Frank, can you give me some examples of the disjunction between official asylum policy and the reality of asylum practice?
Just sticking with Puck's point about the law, I examine regularly people who are seeking asylum, who say they've been tortured in the country they come from, and who have scars, cigarette burns, post-traumatic stress disorder, which are very closely linked with the reason why they had to flee. And yet, when this evidence is put before a court, I'm talking about on immigration appeal tribunals, the evidence is frequently ignored, misused, abused, or traduced by the immigration judge. To give you one example, I saw someone who'd been previously seen and on whom a report had been written by an excellent GP. The judge refused to believe that GP's report because she was a GP. I have two questions for that judge. First, where did you go to medical school? And second, do you normally disregard the advice of your GP because he is a GP?
Exactly. Do you give an example, Maria?
I just actually want to make a comment on the people who end up in detention, and this time most of the asylum seekers who claim asylum and come to this country, they go in fast track and they go straight away to detention center. So as a former detainee, I can say just that the places, they are basically built for these people to be detained. I would actually call them prisons, and the main thing that comes in the people's mind, or asylum seekers who come and claim asylum, why I have been detained. So I've just escaped from my country from the persecution or harm that have been done, and meant to be stepped on the safe soil, and I'm ending up to be detained. For what reason? And to be told, you know, I'll be taken back shortly to my country where I suffered. The way they treat you there, so basically you are become number for them. So if there's a question mark whether you're going to stay in this country or being deported, so you become a number, and the government just want to achieve the targets for these people to be returned back to their country, regardless whether they face prosecution or being, you know, thrown in the prison there or even killed.
Yeah. So just to elaborate on the issue about this decline in proper legal representation, in a way it seems like the system is being rigged by intention or default to ensure that as many asylum claimants as possible fail, because if there aren't the legal aid lawyers, if legal aid funding has been cut, if legal aid lawyers are dropping out of the system because they find it so unsatisfactory, then of course very few asylum applicants can have proper cases presented to a tribunal.
It is the case that an asylum seeker who does not have an articulate lawyer is like somebody without a voice. Huh? In the fast-track cases, they have, the Home Office has announced its intention to raise the standard from 18% detention on arrival to 38% detention on arrival. These people are tallied as if they have legal representation because they get a lawyer from the Home Office. What you do not know, and what is not reported, is that that lawyer will attend the interview and prepare maybe a submission to the court, but then says, you are not going to win anyway because the failure rate for fast track is 98 and 99%, therefore we will not represent you in court.
So you're saying the failure rate for people in the asylum, for asylum applicants who are put in the fast track system, the failure rate is 98%.
It's 99% in Yardswood for the women's detention centre, and it's 98% in Harmsford for the men's fast track percent, or the other way around. These people are nevertheless recorded as having legal representation, even though in court, where they really need it, because they don't speak the language, they're not familiar with the system, they come from countries where statutory authorities are, you know, the same as total impunity. They do not know how to handle an organized system like ours. These people will lose. And yet, those people are represented as, we have a very good legal system, they have all got legal representation. Excuse me? Yeah. The second point I want to make as a former clinical worker, as Frank said, we see many detainees who have been tortured. And you carry in your body the signs of that crucifixion, if you like. If you detain a person who has already suffered detention, imprisonment, rape, and torture, you cause what's called secondary traumatization. And those people become very ill indeed. And Frank can quote you case after case where medical justice has reported people who have been seen in detention by him and his colleagues who've had psychotic breakdowns because they can no longer handle the second layer of imprisonment and torture. That is psychological torture. We do that to our asylum seekers.
I mean, in essence, what we're really seeing is an asylum system which treats refugees who've suffered terrible, terrible persecution, you know, jail, torture, perhaps the murder of their loved ones. They are treated, in effect, as criminals. Asylum detention centres are sort of glorified prisons. And the people in those detention centres actually have fewer legal rights than someone in this country who is charged with rape or murder. Frank, on the issue of legal representation.
One of the things that happens is this. There is no limit on the time for which someone can be detained as an asylum seeker. Even under the new terrorist legislation, people suspected of terrorism can only be detained for 28 days. I've seen people who've been locked up for over a year in detention centers, who were also very ill and were receiving deplorable medical care, but on the point of strictly legal representation, there appears to be no remedy for these people, and they can only get out if they are either granted bail as though they were criminals, which they are not, or if they're granted the temporary admission to the UK, which they might otherwise reasonably have expected when they first arrived.
Maria, have you got any examples on this issue of legal representation?
Yeah, when I was detained, obviously it was back in 2002 and 2001. Obviously we didn't have access to get in touch with our solicitors, and what happened usually, detainees move from one detention center to another one, so you basically rely on the telephone cards that are issued by detention whenever they like, or it's supposed to be once a week. So basically you are cut off from your solicitor. You cannot get advice at any time, for example, if you can, or if you want, or if you need desperately to get, or you've been told that you're going to be moved to another center, or you're going to be deported, and you desperately need to get in touch with your solicitor, and you cannot. Well, luckily it's improving. It seems to be improving, you know, having mobile phones, but again, it's very difficult to get access to mobile phones in detention centers. So, but back in my time when I was detained, that was completely impossible to get in touch with the solicitors.
I can say from my experience of supporting and helping over 100 asylum seekers in the last couple of years, that hardly any of them have had proper legal representation. I mean, less than 5%. Some have had no legal representation at all. They've been abandoned by their solicitors, and they've been forced to go to appeals where they've got no legal representation, where they cannot speak English at all or can barely speak English. So, of course, this is another way in which the system is rigged, or seems to be rigged, in order to fail as many people as possible.
Peter, I think you should also say that 20% of asylum seekers do get refugee status eventually. Huh? So it's not just 5%. We need to be able to see the matter from the other side as well. But what Maria has pointed out is very typical of the type of operational obstruction, which is can never be documented or verified. We see things like somebody has a removal order in 3 days' time, you get a good solicitor involved, they pack him off from the detention centre near the airport, take him over to Scotland, where the law is different, and he no longer has a solicitor. And then they bring him back overnight to be put on the flight the next day. It's very difficult to explain that as anything other than legal obstruction or statutory obstruction. And there are many, many examples like that.
Well, I would go further. I would say it is a deliberate policy of subverting the law to ensure that asylum applicants do not have legal representation when they need it.
I can't say that. I can only say what I observe.
Can we look at the issue of the attitude of judges in asylum hearings and appeals? Do you want to give an example of the problems there? Because I know from my experience, so often I've heard judges come out with the most insensitive, irrational, ill-informed judgments about people.
The most obvious example, and it keeps happening again and again and again from the same judge, is there is a certain immigration judge who sees women in Jarl's Wood who say they have been raped, who often have scars from other injuries during the attack during rape, up to and including human bite marks on their back. And this judge appears to cut and paste the same statement into every one of his judgments, which are invariably negative for the asylum seeker, and it is this. Quote, "Rape is a hideous crime. It is disgraceful for her to make such a false allegation without, in fact, ever looking at or even on occasion mentioning the medical evidence that's been presented to him about that rape."
What does that mean?
It means basically that he has a formula for refusing to believe any asylum seeker, female, who says she's been raped. And he uses the same formula over and over again without bothering to look at the evidence. I would not call that judgment.
it is of course the case that under the Convention rape is now accepted as a form of torture. And what we see, for instance, with anal rape, where the only rape cases that get accepted if there is a decent medical report where anal scarring and internal scarring is being established. Very often the psychological effect of such rape, particularly for people who are Muslim, are not accepted. Can I bring another example? Of the way the court deals in a way that is not unlawful, but is very superficial. We have a number of people who arrive here as unaccompanied minors. These are often young people who've been sent away by their families because the family is active politically. They come from countries where we know there are serious civil problems, such as Zimbabwe, Uganda, the Congo, Iran, a number of places like this, Somalia. They get automatic leave to remain as long as they are minor. As soon as they reach 18, they become an adult in legal terms, and they're treated as an adult. The legal argument of imputed political opinion, that is, you are at risk because of what your family did, applies to these children and these young people. Many of them have come at an age where they do not know why they were sent away, what the history of their parents is. You know, often have lost them. In cases like Rwanda, they have lost the whole family. And yet they are treated in such a way to say that they are no longer at risk. Now, that makes me very angry, particularly if I see young women go back to countries in Africa where rape is a matter of abuse of power and impunity as a matter of course. We know the expert evidence about the Congo, that very troubled country. We know what happens in Rwanda. We know the way Mugabe's militias actually treat women. To send such vulnerable youngsters back on a very flimsy appeal with often very bad solicitors, and the judges say, yes, there is, and the Home Office says there is a remedy in place, we have to have a care plan and a reception plan arranged for the receipt. That never happens, it's never verified, it doesn't work.
So just to recap, what you're talking about is someone who may have been sent here as a child, maybe 8 or 9 years old, because their family was under threat in Somalia or Uganda or Iran or wherever.
Or has been killed.
Perhaps the family's been killed. They're accepted as refugee, but when they reach the age of 18, they're deemed to be no longer a child, but therefore not bound by the refugee obligations, and therefore they're sent back.
They are bound by the refugee obligations. Therefore, they give them a very formal and superficial appeal procedure. These children cannot say why they're at risk. They have not been given the evidence what their parents did. And they say, they're pathetic appeals, because they say in their statements, I have been such a good girl, I have studied very well, I will be a very good citizen, I want to contribute to Britain. And they mean it. And there are massive support from their schools, from their foster parents, from the people who have cared for them. But the point is that the Home Office and the courts look at is there a risk on return? And the assessment of risk of return, in those cases the statutory authorities very often disbelieve what the experts say. That is the case in Congo. We are sending people, as you know, there is a country guidance case coming up about the risk on return to Congo. In such countries, what experts have said, case after case after case, there are risks. You need to look at what the social networks and the military and the intelligence networks are doing. Is dismissed by both the courts and the immigration officers. Not very relevant. You know, we can't prove this. There is a generalized risk, and we're sending people back to death. I have 3 examples. A Ugandan who was returned in April of this year and ended up for 3 months in prison and was tortured very badly. We know where he is. We're in touch with him.
So this is a person from Uganda.
This is a person who was in detention in Britain. Yes, I have his name here.
This is a person who was in detention in Britain, who the Home Office said it would be safe. The Home Office disbelieved their asylum claim and said it would be safe for them to return. Yeah. And when they were returned back, they were put in prison and they were tortured.
Correct. Because Uganda does what Zimbabwe does and what Congo does too. People are screened, interrogated, and taken into detention. And you can get out either with a bribe or after torture or, that sort of... this is what happened to this man. He's now in hiding. He's in fact in Nairobi at the moment.
Frank, give us any examples of of similar situations where people have been sent back and ended up suffering grisly fates?
Even more than that, I've seen a number of people, particularly from Zimbabwe, who, on being sent back, were presented to the immigration authorities in Zimbabwe by the escorts with a letter which said that they were, quote, failed asylum seekers, unquote, in the UK.
Just to be clear, these are Home Office escorts who...
These are privately contracted escorts paid by the Home Office.
Yeah.
Having been identified to, in the case of Zimbabwe, the CIO, the Secret Service there, these 3 people whom I have seen were detained, tortured, and in 2 cases have escaped back to the UK, where I saw them again. In precisely one of these cases, the Home Office have finally admitted that it would be an improper risk to this person to return them yet again to Zimbabwe, and has granted him refugee status. But it is not uncommon for people to be returned and to be tortured, abused, or killed, and the Home Office and the Foreign Office are at great pains not to find out what happens.
So they send them back, they say it's safe for them to return, they send them back, and then they wash their hands of it.
There's no tracking.
Yeah.
There is no tracking at all. Another example is people who are sent back who have converted to Christianity and go back to a Muslim country. We know that people have been killed. We also know that people have to go underground. I have an Iranian case like this at the moment, and I have a Pakistani case like this at the moment.
That risk, to be clear,
that risk doubles.
Changing
Apostasy.
your faith is a criminal offence, punishable by death in these countries.
Under Islam.
Yeah.
The Home Office will say, well, Iran has on the books that it has the death penalty for apostasy, but it doesn't actually do this. The same goes for gay, as you know, the same goes for gay people in Iran and in Muslim countries. But what is never discussed is the interaction between the official authority systems and the social systems, and the interaction between the two. And we do hear of people like this who are killed. 2 young homosexuals in Iran were hung. We have, if you're a woman and you go back to a Muslim country and you have converted, and that is found out, you have no social support because, as we know, for instance, from Pakistan, the social support system for women is not good, and they cannot function independently. That actually goes for a lot of Africa as well. Those people are sent back, and no attention is paid to the culture of those countries is seen from a Western perception by our statutory system, by our judiciary, and by our Home Office. They are seen from the point of view of well-functioning democratic Western European states. We had a wonderful example of the different glasses you need for this. When the Bishop of Winchester, talking about the Congo, on which he is an expert, actually said to the Secretary of State, it seems to me that you are dealing with the Congo in terms of its social fabric and the links between its regime and its social structures, as if the Congo is Dorking.
Dorking in Surrey.
Correct. Our very nice, very peaceful, very well organized, very well off counties area of Britain. That is the gap in attitude that we need to bridge in our statutory systems.
Can we go back to the issue of what happens, the kinds of abuses that happen in asylum detention centres? Maria, do you want to perhaps give some examples?
I just actually want to go slightly another road about the judgment, because as a former detainee, obviously, I ended up being in the court for bail, and also it's also been granted by judge. And now this time, well, when I was detained, I managed to get out on bail with one surety and some amount of money put. But these days, they're basically demanding, to have 2 sureties, and the main excuse for the judge to refuse is there is a risk of absconding. Well, obviously, the Home Office argue with saying that, and there is a risk of absconding or the bad immigration history, which means or the person failed to attend to a reporting center or failed to go to the court hearing once or twice, but they don't care, you know, whose fault was it. But what my point was making about the families and the children, and mainly very, very often, you know, the bail is refused and they remain in detention center, which I believe, you know, the judges should consider it, you know, especially when it comes to children and to small children, you know, what kind of impact on psychological impact they will get in detention, and they should not be actually there, and where this family should run, where should they go?
Do we have any idea how many children of asylum detainees are detained with their parents?
Right this minute, there are something like 70 children in Yarlswood Detention Centre alone.
So that's in one detention centre, there are 70 children who are being detained as if they were criminals and as if their parents were criminals.
Yep.
Of the 9 detention centres we have, 2 of them harbour families. The one is in Dungavel. That is for long-time storage for cases that they cannot easily resolve. They have families. And then there's the Yarlswood one, which is where they shove people through on the way out.
Okay. Well, what about, we've only got a couple of minutes left. I want to get down to this issue of the abuses that happen in asylum detention centres. I know from my experience of the asylum seekers that I've been supporting that they are subjected, not always, but very often, to racist abuse, to sexual harassment, to sexual assaults, to homophobic abuse. You know, there are some very good asylum staff, but there are also some very rotten ones. And I don't think it's unlinked to the fact that many of these detention centres are privately run, under contract, cost-cutting, you know, for-profit institutions. Do you want to give some examples of abuses?
Well, in general, you can't actually describe... well, as a family, I was detained in the family unit with the single people, as you said, sexual harassment, you know, that could happen. But, I mean, I haven't experienced that in detention, maybe because I was in the family unit with my husband. But, on the other hand, in every single detention center, they have... I would say they're supposed to have the same policy and follow the same rules, but it looks like they are separate country. Well, they invite their own policy, they make their own rules, you know, they follow them, they never imply the general policy, the government policy, which should be, and they behave in the way they like, or the way they feel to behave towards asylum seekers. And as I said, as I mentioned, they become numbers. Yeah. So if you are here, I've been told personally, if you are here, if you put here, so you're not supposed to be in this country, you have to be after this country. So you are not considered as a human being.
So the attitude of staff is very much, not universally, but in many cases...
Not all of them,
that people in detention have no right to be in this country, they shouldn't be here, and therefore they don't really have rights as British citizens.
We don't really care about you.
Yeah, but this is just the way institutions work. If you want to discriminate against people and if you want to degrade people, then you first declare them to be less human than you are. And that is what's happening. The asylum, what I find so difficult is that ordinary, very nice British people see asylum seekers as second-class human beings. And that is wrong.
Yeah. I'm sure that is a big part of the issue. It's the attitude towards people from other countries who've come here seeking refuge. They're not treated as full and human beings with dignity and rights like the rest of us. Well, we've run out of time now. Thank you all very much. I'd ask you all to join me again next week for another edition of Talking with Tatchell.